Thank you very much to everyone who's joining us in the room now. Thank you very much for registering, and thank you very much for Macdonald Company for supporting us to allow us to conduct this series. Our plan is to conduct 4 of these episodes, 1 each week over the next sort of 4 weeks. And I'm really grateful to be joined by Laure Duhot, Nick Cuff, and Neil Young. And you've all tuned in to hear from these guys rather than myself. So I'll let these guys hand over shortly to do a quick intro. Pat Hayes, unfortunately, it looks like he's suffering just some technical sort of difficulties. So I hope he'll be able to sort of pop into the room very, very shortly. But a bit of sort of housekeeping before we get going properly. The guys in the audience, we can't see or hear from you unless you're using the chat and the Q&A section. So feel free to correspond with us, and I'll try and keep one eye open on that section. If there's a question that you particularly like in that Q&A section, feel free to uptick it, to vote for it higher. And that way then us and the panelists will be able then to see the questions that we think are sort of most prevalent then to our group who are tuned in. And I'll try and make sure I get round then to asking our group for it. So without further ado, I'll ask for these guys to introduce themselves. Laure, would you mind introducing yourself and what you're doing at the moment?
Good. Well, thank you for inviting me to this seminar, Nick, and thank you for all the attendees to dial in. I'm Laure Duhot, and I've been involved in the living sector for 17 years, both as an executive and also as a non-exec director. I've been on the board of various registered providers. And as an executive, I've been involved in the senior living sector through Sunrise, and then in the PRS sector and affordable sector as well, I should say, at Granger as a managing director when I set up the PRS business there, and more recently at Lendlease, where I was very involved in setting up their PRS and affordable living platform. I have actually left Lendlease very recently, and I'm now acting as a senior advisor for various companies, again, in the living sector.
Nick, would you mind going next?
Sure. I'm Nick Cuff. I'm Chief Commercial Officer at Pocket Living. I'm responsible for land acquisition, commercial partnerships, strategy, and joint ventures. I've been at the business for 7 years, and Pocket is a developer of mainly London-based affordable housing. We focus on intermediate homes, so getting first-time buyers on the housing ladder. And our current program is roughly 1,700 homes across over a dozen sites in London and Greater London. Thank you.
And Neil, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah. So I've been involved in the private rented sector for 20 odd years. Early on as an investor on a personal level, then running my own business, Young Group. Then for about 8 years involved with Get Living. So we were the pioneers in the whole build to rent sector, and at Young Group we're very involved with lots of the initial startup of the sector. And then 5 years as chief exec at Get Living as well. Left about 7 or 8 months ago and set up Young, which is really looking at helping businesses grow, helping people with ideas in the rental sector, but really where people live, stay and spend time.
Excellent, guys. And I should say, as part of me designing our panel today, and really grateful for these guys sort of giving up their time, I did have the idea that it'd be wonderful if we could get a view from each of the sectors across real estate. So Laure's will be speaking to them with our investor hat. Nick will be speaking then with our private developer, and Neil as our operator. Pat, unfortunately, was going to be talking as our sort of social, sort of public sector sort of view, and we'll probably have to just do him justice, or maybe because he's not here to defend himself, just pick on him and blame him for everything. We'll see. So without further ado, let me get started with our first question. And I'm going to ask the panel each the same question. And it comes from Patrick Daly, who's a planning consultant. And he asks us the question, how nervous are the panel regarding the long-term impacts of coronavirus on demand, investment and property values? So how nervous is the panel regarding long-term impacts of coronavirus on demand, investment and property values? And whilst you guys are answering this, I thought it'd be sensible just to get a quick temperature check of everyone in the room. And I'm going to ask you the same question. And shortly it will pop up on your screen, and they'll be able then to come back to that and see how we're going. Laure, would you mind giving your first view? So, setting up then your own company recently, how nervous are you right now?
I think there are two parts to the answer to this. There's the very short term and the long term. And I think it's a difficult question because we don't know whether this virus is going to be here with us for years to come, or whether actually things are going to be sorted with a vaccine and we'll be able to resume our lives. But what's very clear is that regardless of what it is, there will be an impact on the economy, and whether it's a sort of V recovery or a longer term impact will obviously have a big influence on values and the outlook. My hunch is that for the residential sector, at least, there is still some demand supply imbalances. So actually, there's various factors here at play. And I believe that in terms of the affordability, as long as you still can deliver affordable stuff, there is a demand out there. The only long-term, I think, element that we don't know is, if there is very high unemployment for a long time, then I think it will impact the sector across, whether, for mortgage availability, people able to buy, or people actually indeed on the PRS sector able to pay the rent. But I think the long-term outlook, I don't believe is negative, given the demand-supply imbalances we have in the market, regardless.
And so, Laure, the guys who are in the room now, when I've been polling them, I've been asking, on a scale of 1 to 5, one being not concerned at all, 5 being extremely concerned. What would you say as an innocent sort of feel right now?
I cannot say wait and see. So I would say
you can use a half point if you want.
It's a moderate concern for me. I don't think it's it's too early to say how serious it is. There's going to be there's been a lot of liquidity also injected in the market.
Okay, all right, understood. Nick, how about you?
So just in terms of what's going on in the market for us at the moment, let's start with that, and I'll walk back then to the medium longer term. We've had registrations jump by a third in the last week for buying our homes. We've got about 100 homes on the market across 3 sites at the moment. We've got about 300 coming forward in the next 6 months. So you might be thinking, yikes, what's that going to mean? All of the sales that we had before lockdown that were halted by lockdown are still happening. There has been no reduction in pricing from our side, and we think that's partly because there was a falling of supply pre this event occurring. The supply dynamics in London, South East, and more generally, I think it's different what part of the country you're in, but where there were real demand hotspots, supply was struggling to keep up. And that was partly because of the lag effects from Brexit and the investment decisions that were delayed as a result of that, which has meant that whilst there are some projects that have gone forward, not all of the more marginal projects got off the ground. And so therefore, unlike in the sort of 2008-9 period where we were actually seeing a supply uptick just as demand fell off a cliff, what we're probably seeing here is that supply was already on a downward tail. And so whilst there will be a drop in demand dynamics, I'm sure, there will be probably a less substantial drop in pricing, just because there is still a latent pent-up demand that wasn't being serviced. And we're certainly seeing that through the doors. And it's interesting, in Rightmove traffic, we keep really close eye on sales and activity more generally. Persimmon, we look at some of the big house builders too. Rightmove traffic has almost doubled in the last couple of weeks, and I think there's a lot of people.
I think that's just locked at home, wishing you had a bigger pad.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? I think there's a lot of people out there who've had a chance to reassess what their decisions are. and some people are saying, so like one of the interesting stats, and we'll come on to this later, I guess, as well, is a lot of our buyers are living in shared accommodation, and a lot of people are in places which they probably are, who are not owners at the moment, or wanting to get on the housing ladder. And I think people are reassessing their buying habits, and they're looking at the market and thinking, well, maybe it's time to start looking at being serious about getting on it. So I think there's that. I think there's obviously countervailing factors to that too. So look, I think short term, I think there's going to be a bit of a lockdown bounce. Actually, I think medium term, I think it's going to be tough. I think there's going to be some falling of pricing, and I think most of the major agents are talking in the region of 5-10%, and that's because there is going to be a lag effect from lockdown. It is going to be much slower to return to normal because of the restrictions, and also because government has yet to come up with an effective policy around testing. Until we get to that point, we're going to be in this sort of slightly strange state where we're all going to be, or a lot of us are still going to be working from home. And whilst there's some productivity gains from that, there are also some slowdown effects of that in terms of new deal making and getting things done and executing stuff. So medium term, I think there's going to be that drop. Longer term, though, it's the supply and demand equation. So I completely agree with Laure on this, that I think you will see a bounce back. There's a huge amount of latent demand out there. The big question that might change that picture is just how serious the unemployment effect is as a result of this. And we're not going to really know that until August, because that's when employers have a chance to reassess their furloughing schemes. And some will then decide whether they want to hold on to their staff or whether they're willing to cough up more in terms of paying those salary gaps between what the government's been paying. And some will inevitably decide not, and we just don't know what those effects will be. I see Pat's joined us.
Okay, and then Nick, I tried to pin Laure to a number, but she dodged me. What would you say on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being not very, and 5 being very concerned.
Well, I think it's about 3 at the moment.
3, okay. And then Neil, before I ask you your views, I'll just jump back to the polls. So thank you very much for those guys who've answered us. So 2/3. Or 70% of our group are saying they are a 3 to a 5, and we've got a group of about sort of 20, 25, 26 people who are 2 to 1. So I would interpret that as either not concerned or very mildly concerned. So it's safe to say I think the majority of the group here are either concerned to extremely concerned. What's your view, Neil?
Well, I think it's fair to say the residential real estate industry is always nervous about something, so it just gives us something else to be concerned about. But it's also fair to say that I think as a sector we're very good at adapting and innovating. We find a situation, we try and look at how we deal with it. So I think, to use an old term, it's don't panic. There's a temptation to very much react to the now. We can even think over the last couple of months things have, albeit slowly, things are changing. And I think this question's around the long term. So if we think back to the global financial crisis in 2008-9, everyone at that point thought Armageddon and everything was over. And if we look over the last few years, things clearly did pick up. The difference between now and then also is the financing side. Banks are in a lot stronger position than they were. Interest rates are even lower. So I think that will give opportunities on the investment side. The points that have been made about investment fundamentals, supply and demand in housing, absolutely there, and that continues. And I think the other point, if we look at the wider property sector, and this is something I've always said, the confidence in investing in housing compared to retail offices will still be high, and I suspect higher than most. So in terms of where I'm looking, and I tend to look longer term, and even in the short period that Young's been in operation, we've got people coming with ideas about businesses they want to set up in property. So we know in property it's a long-term business. It doesn't happen overnight, and as long as you've got the ability to get through some bumps in the road, I think I'm more positive. So I'm probably at about 2.5 in terms of on the scoreboard.
Brilliant. And Pat, you've joined us right at the time. Do you want me to ask that question again, or? he says right at the right time. I think we've got some problems with your audio, Pat. We can hear you. Just double on the top right hand side. We can see you, but you can't hear you. There should be an option just to make sure your mic is not muted. I'll move on to the next question. Hopefully we can get you involved.
Hopefully Pat can learn sign language between now and then as well.
Yeah, just a simple thumbs up or thumb. Let's give it. Let's use that. Pat, you've got 5 fingers on your hand. How many? A scale of 1 to 5. How worried are you? A 2. Make sure you don't turn them around. Right. Question number 2. And I thought this comes from Stephen Murden, Head of Residential from Legal and General. Given the COVID-19 crisis, what's the outlook for build to rent over the next few years in London? And Stephen was not alone in the over 300 questions we got submitted for this webinar. Everyone wanted to know, what does this mean for the variety of different, particularly maybe more recent evolutions of residential. So it'd be that co-living, build to rent, high density, high rise accommodation, maybe outside of London where it wasn't appearing before. So Neil, I'll pick on you for this one, given your sort of background. What's your view for build to rent?
Well, I think Nick touched on it. COVID has really shown the importance of the home. We've been spending a lot of time in the home over the last few months, and I think that potentially will continue. We've seen online orders increase. We've talked about, in terms of shopping, people are doing 1 shop a week rather than 2 or 3. So people are spending more time at home. And if you look at what's at the heart of build to rent, or should be at the heart, and certainly my view, it's around building a community. And build to rent has been very good at that in the past. And actually over the last few months, I think has adapted very well, even albeit people can't meet up, but there's been the balcony bingo and virtual workouts and things. So people are helping their residents come together. And I think the trend and the importance of good quality homes, well managed, with good long-term security, continues. So I actually think there could be further demand. And I was on a call last week with a number of investors, and there seems to be more investor appetite in build to rent than there ever has been. And I think the other point about it is, from an investor point of view, is the resilience in the income stream. Early on, there was lots of worry people wouldn't pay. Most of the operators are still seeing good income. Yes, there are some people who aren't paying, but the majority are paying. I think Granger reported recently they've been in the mid 90% in terms of their rent received in March and April. So I think people are seeing that resilience, and I actually wonder if going forward people might allocate slightly more money to their home costs because they've realised the importance of it over the last few months. And
Nick, so you can feel free to change this question if you want, rather than build to rent. Use the Pocket product if you wish.
Well, actually, I'd like to talk about build to rent, because I think Steve will know, who asked the question, that Pocket has just launched to the investment market a rental brand, which we are seeking actively long-term investment partners. We've got 2 sites at the moment that we're looking to bring forward to do a Pocket rent offer, and we have. Well, I suppose one thing I'll say is we were about to launch pre-lockdown, and I debated long and hard whether we should wait until the situation became clearer during lockdown, and we decided to go ahead with our launch on time, which was about a month and a half ago, or a month ago now. So during the first couple of weeks, and we've been really excited by the reaction from the sector, the investment sector. We took the view that others would not come forward with investment propositions. So we felt that this might be a time where people would potentially spend a little bit more time and energy on us than maybe looking at 101 other things that would be coming forward, and the market would be perhaps too hot to get the right attention from the right people. We've got 8 or 10 investors, very serious investors, who are extremely keen on what we've got to say. And I think that's a barometer. So I think I won't go into the lifestyle options of build to rent. I think Neil's covered that really well. But I think the market's really strong for this, and we get the impression that there's a huge amount of interest, and we hope that we can be successful with someone and bring forward a real interesting pipeline on small to medium-sized sites for high-density rental with a pocket typology.
Okay, Laure. Oh, Pat, sounds like can you hear us? Can we hear you? No, not quite.
I'll start then.
Just one bit of advice for Pat. If your computer is not picking up your mic, the alternative is to use something like a set of earpods or headphones, and maybe just see if that helps. Sorry, Laure. With your investor hat on, is build to rent still a game you want to be involved in?
So with my investor hats on, and I think Neil mentioned it, but when you look at the overall environment, real assets is very attractive for investors, and within real assets and real estate especially, this is an asset class which is has really performed well, and so far at least the rental collection and the arrears haven't shot up in the PRS portfolio where we have data. It might increase a bit, but if you choose between PRS and retail, there's really an obvious choice there. So I think the investors' appetite for the asset class remains very strong as a bedrock of core investment for their investment real estate portfolio. And the corollary of that is that for investors, one of the biggest challenge of the build to rent was just to get critical mass. And that was really hard to get. And even though the market has picked up, it's still slow, and there's not that much supply. And I think what we've seen very clearly in the last couple of months is that actually you see sites and you see house builders who are thinking, or maybe we want to de-risk a little bit what we have, and they might bring forward some of their sites given the uncertainty on the for sale market and sell them as a wholesale product. So that I think it's going to create also opportunity to accelerate the supply, which actually is a really good thing from the standpoint of the investors.
And I would say from anecdotally from a recruitment point of view as well, so build to rent and the expertise of build to rent has been a huge growth area for us, because we've had lots of traditional residential developers, or even developers who hadn't previously considered residential, who've now wanted to get involved in build to rent. And of course, their best way of de-risking that was bringing in the experience of someone who has been there and done it before. And I think that trend will continue. The idea of wanting to get experience of people who have been through this before will probably continue as well, in order to best avoid any pitfalls or bumps in the road as we go on. So Stephen, I hope that gives you a good answer to your question. The third question comes from Geshin Junker, who's a principal urban designer for TfL. And they ask, anticipating direction of travel, flight to low density suburbia or investment in walkable neighbourhoods, will the housing model with more workspace and private outdoor space grow? So I think what Geshin is asking is what a lot of other people were saying, are we going to see a rush to the suburbs? And that comes, I think, both for office space and also for residential. Laure, I'll pick on you this time. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the short-term trend. I mean, I was on a call this morning with Savills saying, they have a huge increase in inquiries in people wanting to move, not only in the leafy suburbs, but also actually in nice villages in the countryside. And I think part of it is an immediate reaction, and we need to be, to put that to test and see whether it's going to last. But certainly, I think what this crisis has shown as well is that a lot of people are actually able to work from home, and that potentially you could see in the longer trend in the way we work, going to the office, once, twice, a week, but not every day, which means that suddenly you need more space to work from home or in a hub near home. And you're able to live much further and have more space, and it ties up also with the affordability proposition. So I think potentially not so much short term, the scare of the virus, but long term changes in the way we work and live might be here to stay, and might suddenly throw the dice and rejiggle a little bit the pack of card on how people work. And it will not really be the same, not everybody will want to do the same thing, but it might open up some new sort of more forms of sharing living space, workspace, and moving away. And one of the thing, and I think that's a question later on, but one of the thing I'm very excited about is potentially opening up also the single family housing, including for PRS in garden cities and in not just the suburbs, but a bit further away.
So, Nick, Pocket's been known, hasn't it, for compact living spaces in and as close to central London up until now. But you've increasingly had ground floor office space included. Is that a start of an increasing trend? Are we going to see sort of pocket homes with pocket workstations increasing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think mixed use is definitely something that we can and should be delivering. I think just on the suburbs point, it's really difficult in London suburbs to do development because the neighbourhoods are fairly well established, and the last thing they like to see is developers coming forward with lots of schemes. So, there's always been talk of outer London being a really big opportunity, but aside from 2 or 3 outer London boroughs, Croydon, I can think of Barking and Dagenham certainly, and 1 or 2 others who are actually quite forward thinking. Most of the outer London borough suburbs are essentially protectionist rackets, and it's pretty tough. You go down to Bromley, and you're threading the needle really to try and get housing development through there. So it's whilst the idea of suburbs and development in existing suburban locations is a nice one, it's actually very challenging in the planning system to deliver a meaningful housing. I think the idea of sort of garden cities or urban extensions is obviously something that gets brought up quite regularly, and obviously some of that does happen, and it is a simpler way because the amenity issues that you create from existing suburban communities are not so prevalent. But going back to the pocket option, I think high density, well located sites, there's always going to be huge demand for that, for the simple reason that you look at the buyer profile. The buyer profile of people that get on the housing over pocket or people that go into purpose-built private rent are people who are sharing subdivided, inadequately delivered homes in much of London's housing stock, which 50% of London's housing stock is larger housing and bungalows, which has been converted to flats. Some of our buyers are living with 5 or more sharers and relatively cramped conditions, and they have very little private space. So they're really eager to have their own spaces, even if they are compact. So that trend isn't going to go away. I suspect there's still going to be a real appetite for making use of these brownfield, well-connected sites. Can the suburbs deliver? I'm sceptical, but I think you're right. The person who asked the question, that there is going to be some more drive to try and do more development in the suburbs. It's whether we can get the planning system to make that happen in a more effective manner than it does at the moment.
Okay, interesting. Pat, can we hear you? Oh,
you just agree with everything I said.
No, unfortunately, we haven't got your audio, Pat. Could I ask a favour? Rather to lose you on when I next ask, could you tap in your answer into the chat section, and then I'll be interested to get your take on things. So answering that sort of guess your sort of view about the flight to the suburbs. I'm fascinated to know what you think. Laure, if I come to you, are we heading out to the burbs?
I think, not everything is, not everybody has the same needs, but I think, if you're sort of a family with young children, stuck in a 2-bedroom flat with no park around, I think it's been very tough, this lockdown area and period. And I agree that the planning is very difficult, well, everywhere, but including, in the suburb. I think if there's a bit of government push to develop the garden cities, and I agree with Nick, it's been out there for a while. It needs to gain momentum, and I think that if now is the time for it to gain momentum. And I can see how the new practice of working can finally unlock these opportunities.
I mean, just a statistic to jump in there. 60% of Londoners live within a 5-minute walk of a green space or a playing field. So the problem has been during lockdown is that they haven't been able to use those spaces. But we are, as a city, just as a very London-centric view, clearly, are well provisioned in terms of having amenity, not just hopefully within the purpose-built blocks, but in the local areas around them. So I think the London situation certainly is a better situation in that regard, and that in itself is another reason why more purpose-built development of flats and houses is better than the planning policies which encourage in some cases the subdivision or relatively poorly designed for flatted schemes. The Victorian housing patterns are not that well adept at dealing with subdivisions into flats, and you see some very poor examples of that.
And then Neil, what do you think? We're going to rush the burbs?
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic quandary, isn't it? Do you stay in the city or do you move further out? And it's kind of a question that's forever thus and will continue. I think the issue that's been raised is to shift that supply side is going to take a long time. For delivery. Well, I think inevitably people are reviewing their life situation and where they live, and I suspect there may be some interest in where people can to move further out, but then the reality of it hits of travel costs, etc. And the point about less time working from the office, I think it's there's a difference between not working in the office and working from home. And I think what we'll get towards is employers, and they have been doing it already, encouraging their staff to work away from the office. And that doesn't necessarily mean always working from home. It may be in a co-working space nearby. The slight issue you have is if you're further out and you still need to come into work 3 days a week, you can't get a travel card, so you probably end up spending as much on travel as you would with the travel card. So I think there's a bit of a balance there. And I think you may, in the short term, see people an increase of interest to move out. It does come back to the point we made at the beginning is how long are we in this kind of social distancing environment? And I think hopefully at some point that will change. And I think the kind of offer that Pocket and others have still has a big draw to being in near work. Okay, interesting. So
I'll just jump to the chat section so I can get sort of Pat's views. And just for the ease of people, everyone, let me just read this aloud. So at the moment, so this is from some Pat's voice. At the moment, we don't know if we're talking about a long-term change or something that lasts 6 to 12 months, and too early to know. People have had that experience, but may go back to the old ways if the virus drops into background in months rather than years and becomes low endemic. In short, suburban living will become more attractive, and the premium people will pay to live in central London will fall as a cultural leisure offer diminished. Also, if more working from home, a long commute, less of an issue if only doing a few times a week or less.
Exactly. I agree with that. I think if working practice change and, there's a more balance between the time you spend in the office and the time you work. And I totally agree with Neil. It might not be at home. It might be in sort of a co-working space near home. Suddenly it can change things, and if you don't need, obviously if you need to commute 4 even 3 times a week, that's different. But if it's just once or twice a week, then that becomes a totally different proposition.
So Pat brings up then an interesting point that I would really like to get our audience's views on, and it's simply how will house prices be affected? So Pat's thinking sort of central London is going to be affected, and maybe we might see, because of an increased demand, then the suburbs might have an increase. But for the sake of argument, let's stick this question then towards central London, and let's ask the question: how will house prices be affected? And whilst those views are coming in, I'll move to our fourth question, and it comes from Carolyn Waldron, Real Estate Strategy and Transaction Manager. And she wants to know is, what help are we going to get? What do you think will be the government's main objective to kickstart the housing market? Neil, let's pick on you this time. What can the government do to help things get going again?
Well, I think the government's main focus is going to be on building more houses. I mean, it's interesting, during even the early stages of lockdown, it seemed to be a desire to keep developments going. And I think that's something that they'll continue with. It's very much been a target to get to 300,000 homes a year. And I think they'll still focus on that. I think there will be an interest around key workers living closer to where they work, that kind of blue light fraternity. And I think that's been talked about for a while. Chamber of Commerce did some studies into it, and I think they'll want, with the importance of key workers, I think that will increase. But that very much is driven by building more homes. And I guess also tied in with building more homes is a desire for house prices not to spiral due to the low base rate. We saw that after the global financial crisis many years ago. The low base rate was the thing that enabled people ultimately to get more financing. So I think those are things that will be a key focus, and that will continue.
And Pamela on the chat has just asked me just to remember there are people outside of London, and Pamela, you are right. Neil, do you think is there a difference between sort of right now about sort of house prices central London versus the rest of the UK?
London historically has kind of led the trend, isn't it? And some of the stuff I've seen recently is that central London house prices they might be down a bit, but they're certainly not falling off. So there will always continue to be demand, in the central London house price area.
I think the central London price, especially at the prime, but even central London, have come down by 15% probably since their peak at 2014. So they have been steadily going down over the last few years, and they've been hit by various government measures like the stamp duty tax and so on and so forth. So actually, funnily enough, if you put the hat of investors, and especially foreign investors, and you look also at the exchange rate, I think there is a buying opportunity right now in central London and prime central London. It will be interesting to see whether suddenly investors step in or not. But I think if you look on a relative value terms, the central and prime central London market is actually attractive where it is now.
Okay, interesting. Nick, what help would you like to hear from the government?
Well, what the government is definitely going to do is they're going to formalise a new tenure, which is called First Homes, and they're very committed to that. It's a manifesto commitment. We've been working quite closely with the department in terms of the potential opportunity there. The current proposal is a discount market sale home. It's different from shared ownership. You won't own part and rent part, and the discount will be potentially a 30% discount. It could be more, it could be less. I think that will be a discussion stroke a viability question, and that will be a national programme. And affordable home ownership seems to be where the government wants to go. The worry I have with it, and the worry I think a lot of people will have with it, is that it will be potentially a alternative to negotiated supply of other affordable tenures. And I think one of the things that the Section 106 process does is it allows deeper discounted rental homes, which are needed for people who can't access the housing ladder. And the government focus does seem to be entirely on home ownership at the moment. So there needs to be a balance between renting and home ownership. The government direction is very much home ownership. I think there are opportunities of dealing with that. I think small sites, medium-sized sites, the ones that Pocket does, are a much better way of providing additionality of affordable housing supply than actually retrofitting different new tenures onto what is already being negotiated in the planning system. But you will see, I think, a really big determination from government to have a national programme of home ownership. I suspect what they will do is that they will tie it very much to the key worker narrative around COVID as well, and all the people who've been doing a really great job in the health service and other sectors who've been on the front line, tying those housing offers to them. And I think there'll be a lot more money coming as well. I think they are obsessed with of using potential old ideas such as enterprise zones, and zoning has been talked about as well. Possibly arm's length or agencies coming in to deliver housing in areas of much need. So I think we'll see some more of that. And we might see a wider reboot of the planning system, although my sense is that the last thing the industry needs is a fundamental reform of the system. The system is going to need to recover from this. It doesn't need to also deal with the complexity of a new working system to take over from what we've currently got.
Okay, I'm just going to dip in then to the chat to get sort of Pat's views. So I think sort of answer, his take on what will the government choose to do, and he thinks it's going to go two ways. The government's essentially dominated by free market advocates, so suspect will roll back Keynesian commitments to public spending, and then picking up. I think he follows on then saying, I think there will be a new trend to living in rural areas and home working. And he also adds then government should invest in public sector house building as a market, as the affordable housing you can get on site quickly. So, Nick, what do you think about the government getting involved in public sector house building? Is that a recreation of council homes, or is it something different?
Well, I think the government has already done some things in this regard by allowing local authorities to borrow more to sponsor their own house building programs. Whether this kind of government is quite a right wing government is willing to see the sponsoring of direct delivery of council led house building is a question I'm not sure about. I think if some councils can show capability and competence, then I'm sure they will be willing to back them. But I don't see this kind of government relying on the public sector to do direct delivery of housing as their main plank. I think they will look to the private sector, and they'll look to partnerships with Homes England. I mean, I've always felt that Homes England has a wider role in terms of direct delivery, and I certainly think there are some opportunities for some local authorities to deliver really meaningful supply. But I don't think the government will see that as the single answer to this, particularly given their ideological leanings.
So let me ask a tricky question then to Neil and Laure. Given HS2 and any major sort of infrastructure public spending, your Daily Mails and your Daily Express loves this for their front covers, and the government can never get public spending right on major projects. Have they got the skills in order to deliver major housing generation? Neil, if I ask you that question first.
Well, I think the skills are out there, whether it's actually in central government themselves. I think there's certainly, within our industry, there's a lot of good people who can certainly help grow and encourage the infrastructure. And I think when I've always invested over the years, infrastructure is hugely important to where you invest and where you bring in new areas and develop areas. So whether, as I say, the government themselves have exactly the skills, who knows? But I think within our industry, whether in the UK and globally, the skills are there.
And Laure, what do you think?
Well, I totally agree with that. I mean, the government can do two things, facilitate and be a catalyst to accelerate this large infrastructure and really help the planning process, because let's be honest, the biggest problem, the biggest hindrance to the supply very often is actually the planning process. But I don't see the government is not constantly start employing engineers and master, urban planners. I think it will rely on all the various companies out there with those skills to deliver. The question mark is, if you start having this sort of OG process and it takes a very long time to choose your partner, sometimes it's quite heavy procedures and you lose a lot of time. But I don't see the government doing it itself, and there's a lot of different ways of teaming up and helping the private sector. And frankly, the private sector can do it. It just needs to get a bit more certainty on the planning and not too much intervention that suddenly totally muddies the water and distorts the market.
Okay, so Pat's obviously got quite clear views here. It's finance, not planning, is the problem, and house builder model doesn't deliver at scale, especially in falling or flat markets. Thanks very much, Pat, for that. Let me, as we sort of fast approach the end time of our webinar, let me ask a question. If I can ask the panel, just if I can, just for your sort of quick views on this. Daisy Rees, development manager at Kia, asks, what sectors within housing do you predict will experience growth following COVID-19? So I think sort of crudely what we're asking here is, are there going to be any winners from what we're experiencing and any change of habits? Nick, I'll come to you first.
I think there are going to be some winners. I think tech is going to be a huge winner, by the way. I think we're already using much more tech in our own property systems now. So that's not really the answer to housing itself, but using tech so we've got Matterports now for virtual viewings. We've got an app so people can go online and deal with complaints and issues. I think there's just been a much more bigger expansion of technology to interact with buyers and customers. So there's huge opportunities in that area. More widely, I think we're going to see a much more meaningful program of affordable home ownership, and that will have winners, whether it's done through the Section 106 environment or whether it's done through a renaissance in SME house builders. We'll have to wait and see. I think there's a huge opportunity for SMEs out there. Back in the 80s, they delivered something like 40% of the housing output in this country. Now it's down to 12%. It's been shown in the past that the SMEs can step up and deliver, but there are things holding them back. One is finance, as Pat's alluded to. Another is the planning regime, which treats large developments and small developments as the same. And we do need, I think, a differentiation of approach. If we can get that differentiation, I think there's a lot of capital out there that's willing to come into residential, but it does need a bit of support to get it moving in this difficult time. And
then, Laurie, what do you think? What's your sort of a headline take about are there any potential sort of winners out of these changing habits?
So I mean, if I had, maybe I would just pick two sort of winners or opportunities which I think are out there and should benefit from what we've just seen. One I mentioned it is the garden cities. I think that's something that has a potential to take off now. And within the single family PRS, there's a lot of demand from families. And the other opportunities, which I was always interested in, but it's quite interesting that this whole lockdown has really raised the awareness, is the independent living sector. And we've seen the horrendous things that have happened in our care home. And I think, for a lot of people that are very frail, they don't have a choice. It's the care home or nothing. And I think offering a choice of senior living where you have your own, flat and your own front door and you're independent, but potentially you have all the supports you need, is a sector that is very underrepresented in the UK. And I think where more and more you'll see demand, and if you have good quality product coming up, I think there's an opportunity there as well.
Okay. And Neil, What's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's something that, you know, at Young we're looking at, and I think it's sectors that can build confidence through service. So I think probably over the last few months, some people have felt very on their own and they're having to deal with this. I think areas where you have got that service offer, so, you know, build to rent's an obvious one, but I think also senior living, just touched on it a little bit. I think it does show that we should think about that senior living offer. But I think if you had a good senior living offer, even in times as we have at the moment, it would give people that confidence that they're being looked after in the right way. And I think that covers student and even you know, the hospitality sector. There's often gets bad press, but I think people are going to want a lot more from holidays and trips and things when they do stuff. So I think where people will look at the service provision, I think there's opportunities to really grow. Yeah, technology was mentioned, but I think also, I think Nick touched it early on, a lot of people have been living in their homes for a couple of months. I think it's really important for businesses to be talking to those residents and understanding what is it they like about where they live, what is it they don't like, what is it they like about the service offering they've had. Because people are really analysing that at the moment, and at dinner and lunch, they've got nothing else to do, and they're thinking about the things that are annoying them and that they're enjoying. And I think we can probably learn a lot from that as well.
Okay. Well, as we draw to a close, I'm going to just turn to the Q&A section here. And Pamela Grant has asked a question that's had the most upvotes to it. And she asked the question, has there been an issue with your supply chain with construction stopped temporarily and the impact on social distancing, meaning longer term delays in delivery? So what I'll do is, I think the two people who are probably best to answer that is probably Pat and Nick. Nick, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. We lift contractors seem to all be based in Italy and Spain, and they've disappeared. We've lost contact with them. And they're on the critical path for two of our developments. And one of our window contractors has been self-isolating, and they are also on the critical path for our barking scheme, actually, Pat. So that's been a bit of a disappointment. None of our sites are at 100% in terms of manning. One of them's down at 30%. One of them's doing quite well at 80% at the moment, but they're all going slow, and their supply chains have all been disrupted. My worry is that because contractors work off wafer thin margins at the best of times, is that the sector is not robust, and difficulties and contractual disputes and problems with supply chains mean delays and more LADs, more costs. Depends on the developer. If they're off a thin margin themselves, it will create more disputes. If we start losing contractors like we did in 2007, 2008, then obviously that's a big concern, and that will result in price inflation. I noticed Pat's mentioned it, but we've also got Brexit coming, and that's going to have another disruption to the supply chain. So we do need to watch this very carefully. It's a real challenge.
Well, listen, guys, I just want to say thank you very much to our four sort of panelists. I've really enjoyed sort of sitting back and listening and having the much easier job of the four of you in asking the questions. And to the people who are in the room now and the people who registered and asked those questions, thank you so much for creating the essentially the buzz in the environment throughout this by asking these really sort of tough and tricky questions. Inevitably, it's impossible for me to ask all those, but I sincerely hope that we've got through and covered a lot of the content through it. So, Laurie, thank you very much for your time. Nick, Neil, Pat, thank you so much. If you guys want to hear more from these guys, then Nick in particular has got a fascinating blog called, and you can access that at www.propertyviews.com. Is that right?
It's propviews.co.uk. So you've got that completely
wrong. Butchered it. I am sorry. And what I'll do is, we'll make sure then we share this with those guys who have registered as well, if you want to access to it. So thank you once more for joining us, and I can't wait for next week's debate as well. When we carry on in a similar sort of content, but with different panelists, so we'll see their views on it. So guys, once more, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.